Hello everyone, and welcome to a webinar introducing the What Works Clearinghouse's Procedures and Standards Handbook version 5.0. I'm Jeff Valentine. I'm a professor in the College of Education and Human Development at the University of Louisville, and I'm one of the principal investigators for the What Works Clearinghouse. I'm your host today. So in that role, let me introduce Dr. Ryan Williams, a principal researcher at the American Institutes for Research, and Dr. Natalia Nedko-Berry, a senior researcher at the American Institutes for Research. Dr. Williams and Dr. Nedko-Berry are key contributors to the What Works Clearinghouse, and they will be our guides through the webinar today. As you know with these things, we always have a bit of housekeeping before we get started, so I wanted to mention that there will be time for Q&A at the end of the webinar, and we can also address clarification questions along the way. What we would like to do today is to discuss broadly the differences between this version and previous versions of the handbook. If you have questions about how these proposed changes might affect application of WWC standards and procedures in a specific review, we ask that you submit these as part of the public comment process. So if you have broad questions about how the current handbook differs from the previous versions, please use the Q&A box, which you can find at the bottom of the Zoom webinar screen. We might not be able to get to all questions asked during the webinar, but rest assured that we'll address any questions that were unanswered in the archived version. Our goals for today are, first, to announce that version 5.0 of the What Works Clearinghouse Procedures and Standards Handbook is available for public comment. We also aim to describe the major proposed changes to the standards against which studies reviewed by the What Works Clearinghouse are judged, and to describe the major changes to the procedures that the What Works Clearinghouse is proposing to use to review studies under the draft 5.0 handbook. And then finally, to provide a forum for you to discuss changes and raise questions about the new proposed version of the handbook. You can see here that the public comment period started on March 14th and runs through April 1st. The proposed handbook is available on the WWC's website, and later on we'll show you how to submit questions and comments on this proposed version to the Clearinghouse. You can see here that historically, the What Works Clearinghouse has released a new version of the handbook about every 3 years. The refinements to the handbook are based on improvements in education research methods and in the methods used for synthesizing the results of education studies. The WWC also refines its procedures and standards to more effectively meet the needs of education decision makers, and you'll see an example of how we have attempted to do this in version 5.0 later on in the webinar. Before I hand the webinar over to Dr. Williams and Dr. Nedko-Berry, I want to spend a bit of time discussing a significant change to the way that the What Works Clearinghouse is proposing to review studies under the draft 5.0 Procedures and Standards Handbook. So specifically, the What Works Clearinghouse is proposing to use a study review protocol as an umbrella protocol that, in conjunction with the standards and procedures articulated in the handbook, will govern the review of all studies. The study review protocol is a generic protocol that is inclusive with respect to the types of interventions, sample characteristics, settings, and outcome measures that are eligible for review by the What Works Clearinghouse. For both efficiency and consistency reasons, the intent is to review all studies using the study review protocol, even those studies that are being reviewed for a specific WWC product like a practice guide. If you're familiar with how the WWC has reviewed studies in the past, you'll be familiar with topic area protocols. These are things like the Dropout Prevention Protocol and the Adolescent Literacy Protocol. Such protocols will continue to be developed and used, but their role will be more limited. So for example, they will operationally define the characteristics of the intervention, sample, and outcome measures that are eligible for inclusion in a particular WWC systematic review, like a practice guide or an intervention report, and they will articulate the procedures that will be used to locate studies for inclusion in those specific products. We'll have a lot more to say about this later on. So now let me turn the webinar over to Dr. Ryan Williams, who will discuss major changes to the What Works Clearinghouse's standards that are proposed under version 5.0. Ryan?
Thanks, Jeff. So like Jeff said, in this next section, I'm going to walk us through some of the major changes to the version 5.0 WWC standards And after that, Natalia will present a summary of the major changes to the version 5.0 WWC procedures. So prior to the version 4.1 standards, the WWC relied on topic area review protocols to determine which attrition boundary was most suitable for a given intervention. The study review protocol that was developed as a companion to the version 4.1 standards formally designated the optimistic attrition boundary as the default boundary for reviews conducted as part of grant competitions or WWC systematic reviews, such as intervention reports. The version 5.0 standards clarify that teams conducting systematic reviews of interventions must select the appropriate boundary for a specific intervention. And in instances where review teams cannot clearly identify an appropriate boundary, the cautious attrition boundary is used as a conservative approach. The goal of this shift is to make sure that review teams are thinking critically about the intervention and its context during the review process. Generally, if review teams choose the optimistic boundary, it indicates that the intervention is unlikely to affect sample composition, such as staying or leaving. Curriculum or professional development programs are examples where the optimistic boundary may be most appropriate. The cautious boundary is appropriate for interventions that may plausibly affect sample composition, such as dropout prevention or school choice programs. The version 5.0 handbook provides additional examples and guidance to review teams for navigating this choice in the compositional change section. One of the bigger changes to the WWC standards in version 5.0 is when demonstration of baseline equivalence is required to receive the rating meets WWC standards with reservations. In version 4.1, and in earlier versions of the WWC standards, randomized control trials and regression discontinuity designs were required to demonstrate baseline equivalence if they were determined to have a risk of bias due to compositional change, such as from attrition or joiners. That is, they were required to demonstrate that baseline group differences on protocol-specified covariates were no greater than 0.25 standard deviations, and they were required to statistically adjust for any differences larger than 0.05 standard deviations. Under version 5.0, randomized control trials and regression discontinuity designs that have a risk of bias due to compositional change do not need to demonstrate baseline equivalence when risk of bias due to compositional change is assessed using the optimistic attrition boundary. However, they must still adjust for baseline group differences on protocol-specified covariates. Using the optimistic attrition boundary implies that compositional change is not strongly related to intervention status. And because both of these designs assign units to conditions in a controlled fashion, covariate adjustment is often sufficient for addressing much of the potential bias. One of the more significant changes made to the cluster design standards was in clarifying the risk of bias due to joiners. The WWC defines joiners as individuals who enter clusters after the results of random assignment are known to anyone who could plausibly influence individuals' placement into clusters, including family members, students, teachers, principals, or other school staff. Under previous versions of the WWC standards, reviewers needed to determine one of three types of risk of bias from joiners. No joiners pose a risk of bias, only late joiners pose a risk of bias, or all joiners pose a risk of bias. Under version 5.0, the assessment is simplified to determining a low or a high risk of bias due to joiners. And the handbook provides clear guidance for how reviewers should conceptualize risk of bias from joiners. And 3 decision points are used to guide reviewers: the unit of assignment, the unit of measurement, and the potential of the intervention to affect joining. Importantly, the version 5.0 handbook clarifies that joiners are only considered for the unit of measurement. For example, if the unit of assignment is at the school level and the unit of measurement is at the student level, and the potential of the intervention to affect school placements is low, the risk of bias due to joiners is also likely low. However, if the unit of assignment is at the school level and the unit of measurement is at the teacher level, the risk of the risk of bias due to joiners is likely high due to the non-random placement of students in teachers' classrooms. In determining the potential of an intervention to affect joining, reviewers will consider two questions. Are those with the ability to manipulate enrollment aware of the intervention, and could that knowledge plausibly influence placement decisions? And is it relatively easy to join a study cluster after random assignment? The version 5.0 handbook provides guidance for navigating each of these decision points in assessing the risk of bias due to joiners, and similar guidance for evaluating the risk of bias due to individual level attrition and cluster level RCTs in the compositional change section of the handbook. Another change that was made in the version 5.0 handbook was an added flexibility to the attrition boundaries used to assess the risk of bias due to compositional change in cluster designs. In version 4.1 and in earlier versions of the handbook, reviewers would identify a single attrition boundary with which to assess cluster level attrition, individual level attrition, and cluster representativeness. In version 5.0, review teams may select different attrition boundaries for any of those assessments, which more closely aligns with the reality of compositional change threats operating differentially across different levels of units. Under version 4.1 of the WWC standards, bundled interventions or packages of interventions were considered confounding factors, as the inferences about any one intervention cannot be separated from the others. Under version 5.0, bundled interventions are no longer considered confounding factors, as developers and study authors may have good reasons for combining different programs to optimize outcomes. For regression discontinuity design specifically, cutoff values of the forcing variable used to evaluate an intervention or intervention packages that are also used to determine the delivery of other services outside of the evaluation are considered confounding factors and will result in a study receiving a does not meet WWC standards rating. A new measurement concept is introduced in version 5.0 WWC standards. Measure independence. Measure independence reflects the degree of overlap between the team evaluating or developing an intervention and the team that created a study's outcome measure. A non-independent outcome measure is one that was created by the study team or the intervention's developers. A measure that is created by an intervention's developers or a study team investigating its impact on that measure is considered independent if the study provides evidence that the measure is in broader use than the study under review, such as through citations to other applications. Importantly, administrative records, such as those from district or state agencies, are automatically considered independent measures. The study review protocol will define the outcome domains where measure independence is a key review consideration, and it will provide reviewers with a list of known independent measures in those domains. While measure independence is not a strict outcome requirement like the reliability standard, it is considered in the determination of main versus supplemental findings status, which has implications for effectiveness ratings, which Natalia will describe further. Several important changes were also made to the standards for single case designs. The first change involves the reliability requirements for single case designs. In most single case designs, reliability is assessed using some form of inter-observer agreement. Under version 4.1, the inter-observer agreement requirements applied separately to each phase or each intervention condition in the study. However, reviews of high-quality studies found that authors frequently reported inter-observer agreement across individual participants, outcomes, or designs, as opposed to aggregated by condition. Under version 5.0, the WWC relaxed the requirements for inter-observer agreement and single-case designs to better align with the practice observed in many high-quality studies. The standards now only require that authors report inter-observer agreement for the whole design rather than aggregated across conditions. The next changes relate to the design assessment step in the single case design review process. For multiple baseline, multiple probe, treatment reversal withdrawal, and changing criterion designs, the number of required data points within a phase for a study to achieve the highest possible rating has changed. First, to receive the highest possible rating of meets WWC standards without reservations, under version 5.0, these designs are required to have 6 or more data points in their initial baseline phase and 5 or more data points in every subsequent phase. Under version 4.1, these designs were only required to have 5 data points in each phase to receive the highest possible rating. However, under version 5.0, the WWC added an exception that allows designs with shorter baseline phases to still achieve the highest possible rating. Any phases with 3 or more data points and 0 within phase variance, including the initial baseline phase, are considered to have sufficient data points to be eligible. The idea here is that if a phase has 3 or more data points, all of which have the exact same value, gathering more data is unlikely to be informative. Next, the WWC added a new step called limited risk of bias to the review process for these same 4 designs. This process uses the non-overlap of all pairs method to guide decisions about minimal therapeutic baseline trend and evidence of reversibility. This method is intended to be analogous to some of the visual analytic judgments that are used to assess the internal validity of single case designs in practice. So that concludes our summary of the major changes made to the version 5.0 WWC standards. Next, Natalia will provide an overview of the major changes to the version 5.0 WWC procedures. Natalia?
Thank you, Ryan. Before I get started, I want to give everyone a sense of where we are in this webinar. We are 8 slides from Q&A. So if you have questions, please send them to us using the Q&A link at the bottom of your Zoom screen. So we can go to the next slide. Okay. So I would like to spend a little time on the application of the WWC standards under version 5.0. The information that I'm about to present echoes what Jeff shared at the beginning of the webinar, but it's worth repeating. Under previous versions of the standards, the handbooks articulated the standards for study reviews, but delegated certain aspects of how standards were operationalized to topic area teams. Decisions made by topic area teams were reflected in topic area protocols. Jeff has mentioned a few of them, but just as a reminder, I mean protocols such as the dropout prevention, beginning reading, middle school math, and so on. Under version 5.0, all standards that were previously delegated to topic area teams live in the handbook, meaning that they are applied uniformly. In some instances, the handbook and the study review protocol include flexibility in applying the standards. The team conducting an individual study review will decide how to use this flexibility for a specific study. Attrition boundary is an example of where flexibility is available, as Ryan mentioned earlier. The review team could choose between the optimistic and cautious attrition boundaries based on the circumstances of an individual study. Joiner risk in cluster RCTs is another example. Joiner risk is now a review team decision rather than a topic area decision. All decisions that study review teams make will have to be documented. So why do this? The WWC shifted to a more uniform application of the standards because customization of some standards in topic area protocols led to inconsistency. For example, the same study could receive multiple and sometimes different WWC ratings, which the new procedure should help us minimize. Another advantage is transparency about the application of the standards by the review teams. In the next several slides, I will be covering changes in the WWC's effectiveness rating. To make sure that we are on the same page, when I say effectiveness rating, I mean the rating that signals whether an intervention made a difference in outcomes. For example, WWC's effectiveness ratings could be strong effect, or maybe negative effect, or uncertain effect. And the WWC's effectiveness ratings are different from the WWC's research ratings, such as meet standards with or without reservations. But to receive an effectiveness rating, a study must first receive a research rating of meets WWC standards with or without reservations. The WWC does not assign effectiveness ratings to studies that do not meet WWC standards. So now let's see what's changing under 5.0. So first thing is that the effectiveness ratings under version 5.0 are aligned with the Department of Education's evidence definitions. You can see all 5 effectiveness ratings on the slide. So strong, moderate, promising, they align with tiers 1, 2, and 3, plus we have uncertain and negative for studies or interventions with insufficient evidence of effectiveness. In practice guides, tier 4 is also available. Under version 4.1, the procedures handbook had the extent of evidence criteria that captured requirements for different tiers, such as multiple settings and sample size. So the WWC's effectiveness rating and evidence tiers were separated, and under version 5.0, they are united. The WWC made this change to simplify the usefulness and increase the usability of ratings for education decision makers who often need to identify evidence that aligns with ESSA tiers, not only evidence that meets the WWC standards. Okay, moving on. Under version 4.1, the effectiveness rating for an individual study or an intervention report was the highest rating of any main finding. So as a reminder, main findings are typically findings for the full study sample at the end of the intervention. Under version 5.0, the WWC determines effectiveness ratings at the outcome domain level. If a study or an intervention has multiple main findings in the same domain, the WWC creates a composite finding and reports the effectiveness rating for the domain level composite. If a domain has one main finding, the domain level rating will be based on that one main finding. The WWC shifted to domain level composites because a synthesis of multiple findings in the same domain is likely to provide a better representation of the underlying constructs than will any single measurement. All right, so some more information about the effectiveness ratings for intervention reports. And intervention reports include several studies of the same intervention. To determine effectiveness in the intervention reports, the WWC creates a composite for each outcome domain by calculating a meta-analytic average of every effect size from the main findings. Under version 4.1, for the rating positive effects, more than 50% of the meta-analytic weight had to be attributable to findings rated meets WWC standards without reservations. And this requirement remains exactly the same under 5.0. But what changes is that when a synthesis includes findings rated meets with and findings rated meets without reservations, the WWC will attempt to attribute most of the meta-analytic weight to the studies rated meets WWC standards without reservations, such that these studies, or rather these findings, account for at least 51% of the total meta-analytic weight. The rationale for this is to make sure that the most rigorous studies receive the most weight in the synthesis. In some instances, the WWC will use measure independence to determine the effectiveness rating. Ryan has introduced this concept already, but as a reminder, and because it's new, a measure created by intervention developers or study authors specifically for the intervention examined in the study will not be independent. For the outcome domains that have plenty of recognized and accepted independent measures, as is the case, for instance, with math and literacy, the WWC will base the effectiveness rating on those measures. The study review protocol will identify outcome domains for which the WWC will use independent measures. And we will talk on the next slide about the timeline for the study review protocol updates. What is important to remember, though, is that measure independence does not affect the study's research rating, so meets with or without reservations, only the effectiveness rating and only for some outcome domains. Okay, so we only have a few additional things to cover, and then we're going to move to questions. The tentative timeline on this slide, you can see that it puts us to June of this year for the release of the final version 5.0 of the handbook following the public comment period. We anticipate that the study review protocol will be updated and released by this fall. Training and certification guidelines and materials are scheduled for early 2023. There is no additional information that I can share today about training and certification, but more is coming later this year. Finally, as a reminder, what we covered today is a high-level summary of the substantive changes to procedures and standards. There are additional changes, big and small. For instance, the WWC updated procedures for describing and synthesizing effect sizes in Appendix E. Refined procedures for prioritizing and searching studies for review are included in Appendix B. The WWC updated the study definition and minimum reliability requirements. The organization of the handbook has changed also, with most technical information pushed to the technical appendices. That's where you're going to find formulas and computations. So all of this is to say that we hope that you give the handbook, or maybe the parts that are most pertinent to you, a good review and send us your feedback through the WWC help desk. The links you will need are on the slide, and I imagine they're probably popping up in the chat box. And now I'm going to pass this to Jeff for Q&A.
Well, Ryan and Natalia, thank you both very much for that. And we've had a pretty active Q&A going back and forth. So I have some questions that I can throw out to everyone. And why don't I just read the question as it was asked, and then either Natalia or Ryan, I will hand it off to you. So one question is, why wouldn't the WWC include supplemental findings in effectiveness ratings? And so Natalia, since this is a question about procedures, why don't you take that one?
Happy to do it, Jeff. So the WWC relies on the main findings because they have more credibility than supplemental findings. They're usually based on a full study sample, capture impact closest to the end of the intervention, just to name a few characteristics. Supplemental findings also play an important role. So for instance, the WWC may combine supplemental findings to construct a main finding. Cohorts could be pulled to arrive at a full sample. So for synthesis products, such as intervention reports, the review team leadership may modify the review criteria such that typically supplemental findings get promoted to the main findings. For instance, English learners would usually be considered a subgroup, with the findings for the subgroup considered supplemental. But if the focus of a synthesis is on English learners, then the review team leadership may designate findings for this subgroup as the main findings. So I hope this helps clarify some of the main versus supplemental findings nuances.
Okay, thank you. And whoever asked that question, let us know if that doesn't help. All right, so this one is a little bit in the weeds. And Ryan, this is about a meta-analytic procedure. So let me throw this one to you. The question is, can you talk more about the weighting of findings that meet with and without reservations to get to 51%?
Sure. Yeah. So Natalia introduced this concept of kind of a reweighted meta-analytic synthesis under certain conditions. As a reminder, when the WWC needs to synthesize findings across findings that are rated meet with and meet without reservations, the WWC will attempt to give most of the meta-analytic weight, a majority of the meta-analytic weight, to findings rated meets without reservations. So this helps with a number of things. It helps ensure meeting one of the requirements for effectiveness ratings, or the highest effectiveness ratings, but it also helps base the meta-analytic summary effect size, at least in a majority, on the most credible evidence available. But there are three requirements that need to be evaluated before this reweighted synthesis procedure is initiated. So the first one is there needs to be one or more findings rated meets WWC standards with reservations, and one or more findings rated meets WWC standards without reservations in the same outcome domain across studies, of course. Findings rated meet WWC standards with reservations account for a majority of the meta-analytic weight prior to the reweighted synthesis approach. So most of the meta-analytic weight would be based on the with reservations group. And then the third one is kind of a technical, more technical one. The total sum of the inverse variance weights for findings rated meets WWC standards without reservations is at least 87.2. And that aligns to a minimum level of precision for detecting an effect size of about 0.30 standard deviations with 80% power. And the purpose of that requirement is to ensure that there's kind of a critical mass in the meets without reservations group before we give it a majority of the overall weight in the meta-analysis. If any of those criteria are not met, the WWC will synthesize the effect sizes from the corresponding findings using just a typical inverse variance weighted meta-analysis alone. But you'll see this in the appendix. There's now a moderator procedure. So the WWC will test for differences in effect sizes across those two ratings. And in instances where a statistically significant difference is identified, that's a signal that there's probably a pretty meaningful difference in those two effect size distributions. And that's something that would be noted in any summary findings and narrative. And you can see some more of the information on this technical procedure in Appendix F.
Super, Ryan, thank you. That, as I said, was deep in the weeds, but it's a good question, and thanks to whoever asked that one. Okay, so Natalia, this one's for you. What happens to the effectiveness rating when a study has more than one domain?
So, thanks, Jeff. So if we have a situation, we have a study or an intervention report, and there are several outcome domains. Each outcome domain will receive an effectiveness rating, provided it has main findings though, right? So the studies, if it's an individual study, the study's overall rating will be the same as the highest rated domain. But if you have an intervention report, and intervention reports include several studies of the same intervention, then the WWC will report effectiveness for each domain. So there's not an overall effectiveness rating like in an individual study. We can move on, Jeff.
Okay, thank you. So this is a why question, and I'll throw it to Ryan. The question is, can you speak more about why topic area protocols are proposed to have a lesser role under the version 5.0 handbook?
Sure. Yeah, that's a good question. So one way to think about the proposal is that decisions that were delegated to topic area teams under previous versions of the handbook have either been pushed down to review teams or pushed up to the handbook itself. So having most of the WWC standards available in the handbook should increase consistency, efficiency, and transparency overall. At the same time, there are going to be some aspects of the standards that depend on factors observed in individual studies, which implies that review teams are in the best position to make some of those judgments. Furthermore, the idea is that having review teams make some of these application decisions will result in more transparency about the reasoning behind those decisions, because they need to justify and document those decisions along the way.
Yeah, that last point is a good one, Ryan. I think that in the past, our topic area protocols were not always great about explaining why certain decisions were made. Sometimes they were, but this wasn't uniformly true. And so I certainly think we hope that under this proposed revision, that what we'll see is more thinking in the reviews about what the team was thinking about the conditions that they observed in the study. So thank you for that. Okay, so Natalia, you kind of addressed this already, but we're getting a bunch of questions that relate to timeline. So can you talk just a little bit about like when we will start doing reviews for grant competitions using 5.0, and maybe at the same time talk about anything we can say right now about changes in certification requirements and when they would take effect?
So yes, probably with many competitions upon us, it's a big question of when the WWC, well, the grant reviews are going to switch to version 5.0. So there is a gap between when the handbook is released and when it is adopted for reviews conducted for the Department of Education grant competitions. So reviews for grant competition in 2022, so all of this year, will be conducted using version 4.1 of the WWC procedures and standards. We anticipate that starting in 2023 is the earliest when the reviews will be conducted using version 5.0. So as far as the certification, there are going to be requirements and materials coming out in early 2023. And unfortunately, I can't say more about what they're going to be today, but stay tuned because more of this information is coming after the final version is released in June.
Okay, thank you. I know that's a burning question for many folks.
Yeah, and for me too, Jeff, so yeah. I hear them.
Okay, this was a question that came in early. And it was about whether researcher-made assessments for high school mathematics in, say, Algebra 1, Geometry, Algebra 2, the question is, will these be eligible for review since there are no widely available norm referenced assessments. So Ryan, why don't you take that one?
Sure. Yeah, I suspect we'll get continue to get a number of questions related to this new idea of measure independence as part of the public comment period. So yeah, let me see if I can respond to this. So the first thing that I should clarify is the eligibility part of the question. So if the assessment measures outcomes from a relevant outcome domain relevant to the WWC, so WWC defines which outcome domains it's interested in reviewing, the outcomes will be eligible. So the review can continue, and academic outcomes like these ones in math are going to fall into a relevant outcome domain and presumably would be eligible for review unless something else about the study made it ineligible. A potential concern could come up here when the WWC assesses the effectiveness of the intervention to decide if it produced, say, strong evidence of effectiveness. The concern is about the ability of the findings from the researcher-made assessments to contribute to the evidence of effectiveness rating. So this concern relates to measure independence. An assessment designed by the study team for the intervention evaluated in the study may not be considered independent, but if relevant assessments are just not available for that domain, then findings based on the non-independent measures can be designated or kind of upgraded or promoted to main findings and may contribute to effectiveness ratings and may contribute to synthesis. So if relevant measures are available, so if there are clearly available measures that are independent and they're prevalent, then the findings based on the non-independent measures will be considered supplemental and will stay supplemental, and they would not contribute to the effectiveness ratings. The study review protocol that's going to be released later this fall is going to provide some additional guidance and direction on how this rule is applied and where it's applied and what the implications are and where the points of discretion may be for review teams.
Okay, thank you for that. This next question, I'm not sure if Natalia or Ryan should answer it. So Natalia, let me ask you, does the handbook clarify the situations under which we should query, the WWC should query for information about the study sample or the intervention?
There is guidance. You have to go to the appendices. It used to be that prior handbooks have the author query guidance sprinkled throughout. So there is a designated spot for it. So I would say for those who are asking, and I saw these questions popping up, who have lots of concern about how author queries are going to be handled, definitely take a look at that information first. And if you need additional clarity, please submit us your feedback and your questions through the help desk. And we really look forward to those questions to help us clarify anything outstanding that could make the handbook better for all of you.
Yeah, that's a great answer. Thank you. And, just again, the point that one of the things that the public comment period will help us with is to make the handbook more usable for people who have to use it on a daily basis. So if there are things that we can do to help with in that regard, let us know. Natalia, this might be for you also. So the person asked, the general question is, what are the conditions under which an exploratory finding can be a main finding? And so the example is, if authors estimate 100 interactions and then only report those that are statistically significant, and then one of those turns out to be of policy interest, could that be treated as a main finding?
So I think that the distinction main versus supplemental may give an impression that the main finding has something to do with the importance of the finding, like for the policymakers, for instance, right? But the distinction that the WWC makes between main and supplemental is really grounded in the conditions of the study, right? So it's not, the study isn't going to be considered main or supplemental because it's more policy relevant or less policy relevant, or because it's exploratory or not. Really, what the review team would look at is the finding for the full study sample. Is it measuring an overarching, question about achievement, or is it some kind of smaller subscale within the larger measure, right? Whether or not the measurement was taken immediately after the intervention as opposed to some follow-up period. So those are the considerations that go into deciding whether the finding is going to be main or supplemental. And the person who was asking this, and if others are interested in those specific criteria, they're spelled out. I remember off the top of my head, go to chapter 7. At the very beginning there is how to decide if a finding is main or supplemental, which is a really helpful guidance to use in helping you think about how WWC would consider a finding main or supplemental.
Great, thank you. And thank you for the citing chapter and verse for where that stuff lives. Okay, so here's another question. And I actually, I saw this when it came up, and I think it's a really good question, and I'll answer it myself. And Natalia and Ryan, jump in if you think I'm off the rails, or if you think you can add to my answer. The question boils down to, it's a question about what constitutes an independent measure. And the questioner is asking, if studies use modified independent measures, will they still be considered independent? And I do think that that's a really good question. It speaks to a gray area that I think is going to have to get worked out. My initial response to that question is, there are modifications, and then there are modifications. And the cleanest case for us will be when a measure is modified so that drop items that maybe aren't relevant to the intervention or something like that. That's kind of shaping the results that one expects to get from that measure. And I think we would look at that fairly suspiciously. Other times you'll see people dropping items for reasons that don't appear to be related to the intervention, like they don't seem to be behaving well statistically. And so, I think that we would probably want to be able to draw a distinction between those two types of modifications. But in general, I think that, yes, this is going to be something that we're going to have to think very carefully about in the future. Ryan, Natalia, add? I'll give you a second to jump in.
No, nothing to add from my end, Jeff. That's exactly what I would have said.
Sounds good to me too, Jeff. Thank you.
I think that wraps up all of the questions that I think we are prepared to address today. There are a couple more that are going to need a little more thought. But we have a record of everything, and we will be sure to answer them when we create the final archive version of this webinar. So I'll give just a moment to see if folks have any additional questions they want to pose right now. And if you're sitting typing wildly, I'll just say to everyone that you can see here that we have a link up to the help desk. So if you want to contact us, that's the best way to do it. And I also wanted to say thank you to Dr. Nedko-Berry and Dr. Williams for their help and expertise. Danny Swan was helping us behind the scenes. We have a captioner who was helping us. So just to everybody, thank you, and thank Molly Kane for organizing all of this for us. I don't see any other questions, so let me just say thank you all for attending. We appreciate your interest and your engagement. And again, let us know if we can be of help in any way. Take care.